And in the last hour, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said the EU will massively boost defence spending.
Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilise close to 800 billion euros of defence expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe. We will, of course, continue working closely with our partners in NATO. This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up.
As you can see, Ed has joined us here on set to discuss the significance of all of this. Firstly, Maury, what has been the reaction from Downing Street?
So when you talk to senior government sources, they insist that the government is continuing intensively to bring the US and Ukraine back together, despite that spat at the end of last week and then the pause in aid to Ukraine from the US as well. They still remain convinced that that is repairable and that work can be done through heavy diplomacy from the likes of the UK on that. And just in the past few moments, Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, has been speaking to journalists in her reaction to the pausing of aid to Ukraine.
Well, the Prime Minister set out yesterday that we are absolutely focused on making sure that we get that peace and the security guarantees as part of that. He mentioned in the House that we won't be derailed or sidelined by commentary, ongoing commentary, but that we will use our relationship, our long-standing relationship with the US and our European allies to support Ukraine and President Zelenskyy in getting that peace deal and making sure those securities are part of that. What the US government decides to do, that's entirely their decision, but the UK and the Prime Minister is very clear on our support for Ukraine and that we need that peace deal. And the President Trump has said that we need a peace deal as well, and we're focused on making sure we get that over the line with US support and our European partners.
What I'd say, Maury, whether it was the statement that we got from Downing Street spokesperson Alex Norris earlier, Angela Rayner, unequivocal ongoing support for Ukraine and Zelenskyy, but not going as far as to criticise the US.
No, not at all. And I think a really interesting moment in that interview was when she said, the government won't be derailed by commentary. Now, the government is trying to play this down at the moment. We heard the similar line from Alex Norris saying, you know, I'm not going to comment on every twist and turn. The difficulty is, this isn't just commentary. Mm-hmm. This is the US making a strategic and assertive decision to pause aid to Ukraine in a time of war. That is not a twist and turn. That is not commentary. That is action. And therefore, the UK government are going to need to decide what they're going to do on this. They are trying to play it down, but it's a huge deal.
The EU's obviously reacted immediately this morning, Ed, and we listened to that press conference from Ursula von der Leyen. At the end, she touted this could release up to 800 billion euros of defence spending, obviously with no real time frame of when we get there. One of the measures she announced, though, was a sort of relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact. Just tell us what that is and how significant that could be. So
Europe, in the same way that we have fiscal rules, basically rules that are kind of constraining how much governments can borrow and invest in the future, Europe has the same thing. It's called the Stability and Growth Pact, and it basically says that across the zone, you need to try and keep your deficits below 3% of GDP. And you'll probably recall this, from the euro crisis. Part of the issue was people, were borrowing far more than that. And now she said essentially they could relax those rules. And that's kind of important because, where is this extra money for defence spending going to come from? A lot of it potentially will have to come from extra borrowing. And that in turn then raises questions about the rules. And you've got a kind of, a mirror conversation happening in each of the different countries across Europe as well, because it's not just this European rule. Each different country has their own fiscal rules. I mean, look at Germany. They want to try and keep a balanced budget. Look at the UK. Obviously, we're not part of the EU, but we have our own fiscal rules and we have to have those conversations. And there's going to be an interesting talk about that when it comes to the update for Rachel Reeves. But there's another thing going on in Europe as well at the moment, which is that there is this enormous amount of Russian assets which have been kind of set aside. These are Russian assets that were held overseas, and actually a lot of them in Europe. They're kind of sitting there, and some of them have now almost kind of been repaid. They've gone to maturity, so they are effectively cash. And there is a live debate right now as to whether Europe could take that money, I think it's about like 300 billion euros or so, take that money and then give it to Ukraine.
She didn't mention that at all, though, in the press.
No, she didn't. I think, generally there is, like I say, it's a live debate. It's tense at the moment because I think for a lot of people, there's this question about what does this say for the rule of law? If you've got Russian assets that are put in the country and someone else basically seizes them in the event of something like this, what does that mean what does China think about that in the future? And then what does that do to global capital markets? I mean, for some people, it's pretty straightforward. Russia has invaded Ukraine, you take the money, you give it to Ukraine. But for other people, there's kind of deeper rule of law questions that this raises. But as you say, there is no decision yet on that. But what we do know, I mean, as Mari was saying, right now, Europe is trying to actually make decisions. It's not, it's not talking. But Europe is not used to kind of quick decisions that change everything overnight.
So just a quick question to both of you to round this part of the discussion off. How likely is it that Rachel Reeves does change her fiscal rules, like Europe seemingly is on the Stability and Growth Pact, because of just defence spending and national security? Is there zero chance? High chance, Ed?
I think there's a chance. It's just tricky for her because she has spent so long saying the fiscal rules are ironclad. She spent so long saying that. And obviously, look at what Keir Starmer did last week about defence spending. It was specific, it was explicit, wasn't it? We're taking the aid spending and we're putting that across to defence. So you can see they clearly still see that straitjacket as very important. I don't think we're anywhere close to them throwing out the rules. That being said, you couldn't really have an opportunity which is clearer to be able to do that. Or indeed to say, well, maybe there needs to be more taxes in the future because it is a totally different world we're living in right now where Europe needs to spend more for its own defence.
Do you think they're considering it, Mari?
I think it's always going to be on the table. However, I think it's politically painful, especially, as Ed was saying, because they have, spent so much political capital on attacking the Tories for being economically kind of irresponsible as far as they see it. And one of the kind of pillars of their promise to be economically responsible and never to play fast and loose with the public finances, which is the phrase we heard again and again during the election campaign, was about sticking to those fiscal rules. Mm-hmm. And very, very quickly, on that 300 billion debate around those frozen assets, interestingly, the talk about giving it to Ukraine is one side. Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, actually tweeted a couple of weeks ago saying that the US wants access to that cash and they see that as compensation for all the money they've given to Ukraine. So there is a debate about who decides to get that cash, and the US clearly perhaps agitating behind closed doors that they should have access.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that. Just want to bring you some flashes coming across from the Kremlin saying that it seems as if European countries will try to compensate for the loss of military aid. They're commending the US, saying we can only welcome Trump's wish for peace in Ukraine and saying that we need to see how things develop on the ground. If the United States stops the supplies, it will be the best contribution to the cause of peace. So some of the kind of comments from the Kremlin that you might expect on all of this. Now,